Welcome everyone on the call. Welcome to this week's Process Safety Forum. The topic this week is Hazop, as I mentioned before. We are streaming live to YouTube and Facebook, so just be mindful of what you ask and say, and be respectful. Everyone, including you all on the call, are donating your time, so make sure that you are mindful of that when you talk to others. So it's just gone 8 o'clock in the UK here. So I'm going to start the presentation on Hazop. There's not a lot of content. So as I said before, this is our weekly Process Safety Forum. Today's topic is Hazop, and I am the only presenter today. My name is Louise Whiting. I have had over 12 years experience in the Hazop technique, with more than 300 days of attending Hazops, LOPAs, and hazards. I have facilitated several of these workshops, and I actually really enjoy these sessions. So I'm going to be giving you a brief overview of the Hazop. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction. I'm going to open the floor for questions, and then towards the end we'll announce next week's topic. So we're going in now to the quick introductions. As I said, my name is Louise Whiting. I run a company called Barberton Limited, providing process safety services for various industries. I previously worked 11 years with BP and Shell in mainly operational roles in process safety, but that did include quite a lot of Hazops for new builds as well as existing facilities. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview of Hazop. But before I do that, I'm going to just quickly do a little poll. So you'll see a poll coming up on your screen. So if you just answer those, there's only 2 questions, just a bit of fun. So I know what level the audience is at, so that when I give the introduction, I can do the right level of introduction. Okay, just a few more moments. All right, well, you can see that at least some people on the call have fallen asleep in a Hazop, and to be honest with you, I don't blame you. A lot of the Hazop meetings happen just after lunch. The room is very warm, and also it's a kind of a nice, gentle tone of the presenter, and it's very easy to drift off. Do you feel your Hazops are very effective meetings? Yes, some people feel they are very effective, and other people feel that sometimes, and that's probably a really good representation of a Hazop. So if I go back now to the presentation. So Hazop is a structured technique for a systematic review of typical process hazards. So because it is of a structured nature, it can become a bit monotonous, especially if you're doing a long Hazop. And so if it's difficult sometimes to maintain your attention. However, if you have a good facilitator, they can guide you through the process and make it less painful and a lot more engaging. It's a creative meeting. So in this meeting, we're trying to think outside the box. We're trying to figure out how we can break the system on paper. It's a multidisciplinary method, right? And when I say a multidisciplinary method, it means we need a lot of different people. And this is probably why some of you are saying that sometimes your Hazops are effective and sometimes they are not. It is largely dependent on the facilitator, but it can also depend heavily on the team that are involved. If your team are not aware of the hazards, they don't understand the process very well, or they are very distracted, that can really impact the outcome of your Hazop. It does require a trained and experienced study leader. If you have somebody who is not aware of the technique or is not very familiar with it, trying to lead you through this, you are going to run into problems, and you will notice that in the meeting. The meeting is recorded, and I'm not meaning recorded like we're recording this session. I'm meaning that the meeting is recorded in writing of what is written. And the reason that this is done is because this meeting records are often referred back to if there is an incident. So if you guys have watched any of my posts, which I've put on about the CSB, there will often be a reference back to something called a PHA, or a process hazard analysis. And that is typically a Hazop for a process system. And that is the record, the written record of the meeting. And you can often see in those that perhaps the hazard wasn't discussed properly, perhaps actions weren't closed properly, and that could have led to the accident. So this is a recorded meeting, and it is often used in a legal sense. During this meeting, we have recommendations raised. So if we identify any gaps, we will raise recommendations, and those will then be recorded in the session and closed out in writing after the session. It's not perfect. So as I've mentioned already, it really depends on the team and the facilitator, and actually the information that you had at the time. You don't always have the information that you may want or may need, and so therefore you may not be able to make the decisions you need to make in a Hazop. So it does require a periodic review. Typically, a review of the Hazop happens once every 5 years, but it can happen more frequently than that if there's a big change on the facility. You have different types of Hazops at different times. So if you guys have only been to 1 or 2 Hazops, you might be thinking, oh, what, there's even more different types. Yes, there are different types of Hazop. And if you want to know a little bit more about the different types of Hazop, then get in touch with me. And I've also got some training courses on the different types of Hazops and when you might use them and what you might get from them. Okay, so that's all I've got today for the presentation. I'm going to open the floor up for the Q&A. So if you guys just type your questions in and I will start answering them. The most common question I have at the moment is, can we do remote Hazops? Now, if you have a good facilitator, yes, you certainly can do remote Hazops. But if you don't have a good facilitator, then it probably is best not to. Now, the thing is, most of the considerations you have when you do a normal Hazop are the ones you have when you do a remote Hazop. However, when you are when you're preparing for a remote Hazop, that is much more important than the face-to-face Hazop, because you don't have the time or the luxury of being able to recover if you haven't done your preparation well. Okay, so I'll just wait for a couple of questions to come through on the Q&A. This is the first time I'm using the webinar function on Zoom, so I don't know if anybody can let me know if you're having any problems, but I presume that the Q&A function is simply the same as the texting function, and you guys just type in your questions. Hi, Rajiv. Are you having any problems getting into the Q&A? Perfectly all right. Excellent. So another thing that I get asked about Hazops is which type of Hazop should I do when? So if you only do one type of Hazop, that's fine. And that would normally be a detailed design Hazop. And that is where you have almost all of your information available. And that can be done either during a project phase when your design is sufficiently mature, or during an operate phase. And then if you're doing that sort of detailed Hazop, you really need quite a lot of information and a really good preparation. So I can go into more details of that if you want, but I have had a question come through. So do we consider safeguards when estimating severity, or severity is estimated without considering safeguards? So for anyone who is familiar with the Hazop, we identify a cause, we then identify the consequences. And so this is what the question is referring to, the consequences, i.e. the severity of the consequences. When we document the consequences, we always need to do that without the safeguards. If we don't do that without the safeguards, there is a potential that we underestimate the consequences and therefore don't put enough safeguards in. So for example, if I'm thinking about my circuit breaker at home, and I'm thinking, okay, well, if I put my finger in the electric socket, nothing's going to happen to me because the circuit breaker is going to go and I will be safe, right? So then I can document that in my Hazop. that I put my finger in and nothing's going to happen to me because that will happen. And so the consequences are not recorded to the end. However, if for some reason the circuit breaker failed, then I would become a fatality. But if I hadn't recorded that, when we get to some cost challenges on the project, it's very easy to see how some of the safeguards can be taken out if the consequences are not recorded without the safeguards. So I'm looking at this design and I'm thinking, well, there's a switch and that you can't really get your finger in there and you need a circuit breaker. No, we'll take the circuit breaker out. We'll just keep the other two because it's nothing bad is going to happen to this person if they stick their finger in the plug. So making sure that you have the option of recording the full safeguards without full consequences without safeguards. Make sure that you can assess the safeguards and say, okay, well, considering that we could have 3 to 4 fatalities plus significant off-site environmental impact, are the safeguards we have listed sufficient? So the next question I've got is from Christopher. Have you ever experienced conducting a Hazop using a digital twin environment? I assert there will be multiple benefits: asset visualization of risk, access to all data of the assets, collaborative work environments that allow wider and remote participation. So I have done a Hazop. I'm not sure if this is exactly what you mean, Christopher, so just get back in touch if it's not. But I have done a Hazop using a VC video conferencing call. So the operators and at least one process engineer was at site, and the facilitator and other participants were on the other end of the video conference. We had a facility to share drawings so that we could point where we were. Also, that was really, really helpful when we had a question in the Hazop. So for example, we had a question about some of our drainage system. There was a concern that some parts of the drain didn't have adequate support because of erosion in the area. Well, we had that question in the Hazop, so we just asked the operator if during the break they wouldn't mind going out and having a look. And we found out that the area that we were talking about was subject to this erosion and subsidence. And so therefore, when we had the recommendation, we could specifically mention this area. So having that sort of option to be able to connect with the facility and have the operator still based at the facility is really useful. However, having everybody in the room, sometimes you can't get better than that, right? Because when you're on the video, you can push mute, etc. So making sure, if you can at all possible, I know it's difficult now, have everybody in the room, but if not, having this sort of video conference or digital twin where you can connect with the site and they can go and check things out in the break is great. All right, I have another question from Mahmood. Is batch Hazop good for sequence operations? So yes, it's sometimes called a procedural Hazop or a batch Hazop. Yes, that is what you should be using for sequence operations. It'll be asking questions, not only more pressure, is it possible to get more pressure, or more temperature, less temperature, which is the ones we typically use, but it will also ask questions like, what if you did this step early? What if you did it late? What if you didn't do it at all? And the reason you would want to do this type of batch Hazop or sequence Hazop is to identify which of the steps are critical in completing in a certain sequence. And then those become critical tasks, and you may get additional sign-off for those parts of the procedure. Now, I posted a couple of months ago on a reactor that had a runaway reaction. It was critical that the operators completed one step before they went to the next. However, during the startup, they didn't do this. They did the steps out of sequence. And as a result, the reaction went into runaway. However, it wasn't very clearly from the CSB report, wasn't very clearly articulated the importance of doing one step before the other. So making sure that you, if you do these batch Hazops, that's a really useful way of identifying which steps are critical. Another thing that might come out of your batch Hazop is that you might identify that procedural control is not enough and you might need some engineered control, but that will come through in your Hazop. I've got another question is, do we need to calculate risk before and after introducing additional safeguards or recommendations. Now, I've seen a lot of workshops where we are really worried about the likelihood. Generally, when I run a Hazop, I prefer to focus solely on the consequences, because if you have quite a mature organization, you'll be moving directly from Hazop into LOPA, a layer of protection analysis. And during a layer of protection analysis study, you are looking at the likelihood in great detail. So there's no need really to look at the likelihood in great detail during the Hazop. However, sometimes companies like to do the likelihood in the Hazop, and sometimes people like to do the likelihood before safeguards, after safeguards, and then have a look at the recommendation and then look at the likelihood after. I think it's quite a lot of effort. And when you are in the Hazop, you don't actually know how that recommendation will turn out. You don't know how they're going to close it. I mean, you have an idea of how you might like it to be closed, but that might not be physically possible. There might be some engineering reason why you can't do that. There might be some physical orientation or the weather or something you haven't thought of as a team, which is why you've raised the recommendation for the engineers to go away and look. Now, if they come back and they don't address it in the way that you thought, and you've already qualified how much risk reduction will happen from that recommendation, it can give you a false sense of security of where you get to. The other thing is that it takes quite a bit of the team's time to look at the likelihood. So I find it's much better just to focus on the consequence, getting that right. So getting the severity right on the consequence. And then if you want to record likelihood, record that offline afterwards, or record it at the end of the day. So just go back and say, okay, well, we had this likelihood, this, you know, just doing it in a batch if you have time. But it depends on your policy. In general, I don't like to do it because people have a lot of discussions about, I've never seen this. Yes, maybe I've seen this once, and it really depends on the team. But if you need to do it, then do it. In my experience, it's better to leave that until the LOPA session or until after you've closed the recommendation so you know what was done. So I've got a question from Amin. This is the same one you typed in the chat. If a Hazop is done periodically every 5 years, what would be the best practice to compare or analyze the progress? So when we do the Hazop revalidation, there's two types of revalidation that we do. If you've done a really good Hazop the 5 years previous, you can do something which is just called a revalidation or Hazop by difference. So you have a look at the drawings which are Hazop 5 years ago, and you have a look at the new drawings. And if you identify any changes between the two, you Hazop those sections, and you just validate that the other parts of the Hazop which were examined before are still valid. Now, that's okay if you guys did a really good job of recording. You can do it in that way. If you didn't, then it's better to just start from scratch, so a blank piece of paper, and re-record the Hazop. It takes a little bit longer, but it means that you have a good chance of checking you've got everything. What the facilitator should be doing in the background is checking that we have identified everything that was done before, and then highlighting anywhere where we've identified anything new. So what would be the best practice to compare or analyze the progress? Well, what we want to see between the first Hazop, which was done 5 years ago, and now, is that at least the high priority recommendations have been closed with the desired intent. So if we wanted to make sure that we were maintaining something, even if we suggested the wrong way of maintaining that, but we've closed the recommendation to make sure it's maintained, then that means that we've done a good job. So that may be something that you want to track or analyze when you do your re-Hazop or your Hazop validation, is having a look at which high priority recommendations were closed with the desired intent. If we find out that all of the recommendations were closed, but only 20 of them addressed the risk which was identified in the Hazop, and the other 80% were just closed because they were too hard to close, or there wasn't enough money, or they would be closed later, that's how they were closed, then you know you have a problem with your recommendation closure. So that's something good to track. Another thing would be tracking the number of changes which have happened to your drawing, which have not been subject to Hazop in between the two. So sometimes things can change on your facility and you don't do a management of change. However, when you do the as-built or the as-built drawings before you do your Hazop or Hazop ready drawings for your next revalidation, some of these changes can be picked up. Now, if you identify a lot of changes which haven't been subject to Hazop, again, that's another great way of finding out if your processes are working well. And then the last thing I'd probably do when comparing or analyzing progress is having a look back at the incidents that have happened in the last 5 years, right? How many of those incidents were identified as potential consequences in the previous Hazop? Now, if they were all identified, great. If they were all assessed to be fine and there was no recommendation, big problem, right? Because the team were not really analyzing or didn't really understand the hazard or the system that you had in place, and therefore they didn't identify a recommendation. If you had incidents that had they'd been identified in the Hazop, they had recommendations against them, but the recommendations were enclosed, you could then think maybe there's a problem with your recommendation closure process, maybe it was too slow. Or if the incidents were happening and they'd never been identified before, then you can start to think, oh dear, maybe we had a problem with the people who were in the team. Maybe the team wasn't sufficiently competent. Maybe they didn't have the right information. Maybe we put adverse pressure on them with regards to time. So those are the three kinds of areas I'd look into. One, were your recommendations closed with the desired intent? Two, what were the incidents in between? And three, were there any changes between the two sets of drawings which were not covered by a management of change? So I've got a question from George. In your experience, how would you ensure a deep technical knowledge of the scope of the PHA by the participants? Okay, so there's two parts to this. Number one is not everybody in the workshop needs to be an expert in the PHA process, only the facilitator. And the facilitator needs to make sure that everybody understands the process and sticks strictly to the rules. So I'm quite strict when I do these sorts of sessions, and that's because I want everybody to be following the process, because if we follow the process, we have much less chance of missing things. If we're jumping from flow down to temperature, back to flow, and then to pressure, and then to maintenance, and then back to flow, we're going to miss something because we're not going systematically through. How do I make sure that they have the deep technical knowledge of the scope? This is tricky, right? So if I'm the facilitator, I will request that people of sufficient competence or knowledge with regards to the system are there. During the session, if I'm getting the picture that people don't know what's going on, during the break, I will ask people if you can get somebody who's more familiar with the system. And if that doesn't work, a good trick for a facilitator is just to start raising a lot of recommendations. And then people start thinking, oh my goodness, there's all these recommendations we have to close. And you say, well, if you know somebody who has the answers, if you bring them into the next session, we can answer those, remove those recommendations. So that's another way of getting someone more senior into the meeting who has more knowledge on the system. It is really difficult, especially with COVID, to get someone who has sufficient operations knowledge of the system in the meeting. However, this is really crucial. Getting someone who knows the system and who knows how it operates is really important when answering the questions in the Hazop. And then we have, should the facilitator spend time on setting up a due diligence mindset before starting the PHA? So whenever I do a Hazop or a PHA, I make sure that I do a safety moment before the session. In general, I try to find a safety moment linked to the topic that we are going to be discussing that day. The CSB videos are a great resource for that. The other thing that the CSB videos do, without me explicitly saying, is because they are referring back to the PHAs, as I mentioned before, they are demonstrating to the participants subliminally that what we are doing is really important and it will be held up in a court of law or an investigation, and therefore we need to make sure that we go through this process well and we do it in a diligent way. The other way that we can get this due diligence mindset is when we set up the rules of engagement before we start. Whenever I do the Hazop the first time with that team, I make sure I cover the rules which are defined by that company or that organization for Hazop. So if the company or organization want full recording, that's in my presentation. If they want to make sure that we have a process engineer, instrument engineer, and operator in all the sessions, that's in my introduction. And I say, if any one of these people is not present, we will not be able to continue. So setting that up during the initial presentation, setting expectations, and then holding people account during the session is a really good way of getting that due diligence mindset without being too a bit like a headmistress teacher kind of telling. Just trying those subtle cues, making sure you define the rules at the beginning, letting everybody know what Hazop is, even if they've been to a Hazop before, and what it means at this facility for this organization. And then just keeping people to the rules, making sure that you're following the process time and time again. Right, I've got one from Assad. So Assad says, I want to know, is hazard mapping an integral part of Hazop? What needs to be considered while carrying out hazard mapping? So Assad, I'm not sure what you mean here. With regards to Hazop, what we do is we record each of the items on the drawing, and we have a look at the hazards associated with them being open, closed, etc. I think what you're referring to here could be one of two things. Hazard mapping could either be where we map the hazards to the different locations, like what we might do on a quantitative risk assessment, and then having a look at how the hazards are grouped in different areas, or mapping them together. So when we prepare for the LOPA, or the layer of protection analysis, what we will be doing is we'll have a look at all of the scenarios which could result in a specific consequence, right? And so all of those threats will be mapped to that one consequence in the LOPA study, and then we will have a look at the safeguards which are effective for each of those causes for that one consequence. So that's another type of mapping which I think you could be referring to there. During the Hazop, it's not really important to be worrying about these things. The main thing to do is to make sure that you go systematically through the entire system on the drawings. You follow all of the guide words specified by your company or your standard, whichever you are using, and you make sure that you record it consistently. Afterwards, you can do whatever mapping you may be wanting to do, but during the meeting, try not to detract from the task at hand. You need to go systematically through the guide words, you need to go systematically through the drawings, and you need to record it diligently. So I hope that answered that. Aside, if you have any follow-up question, just put it back in the Q&A. I've had a question from Masarat. I hope I pronounced that right. Is there any design-related change proposed during a Hazop discussion that is still not on the PNIDs? How is it catered for? So this happens quite a lot, actually. So, for example, you're in a project, you've had maybe a lot of pressure to do the Hazop. There might be some contracting reason for that. For example, maybe you are going to get paid after the Hazop or something. So there's a lot of pressure to do the Hazop at a specific time, and the design is not 100% fully mature. So what you could find yourself in is going into the Hazop, and some things are still maturing on your design. And so when you get into the Hazop, people start saying, oh, but it's not really going to be like that. It's going to be like this, or no, this. No, in the Hazop, you Hazop the drawings that you have available to you. If there is an obvious mistake, for example, they've put £300 system and it should be a £500 or £600 system, then you raise a recommendation or a drawing amendment to fix that. But you document what the consequences of not fixing that is. You have to assume that the drawings that you have been given are the final drawings and Hazop that system. Now, sometimes life is not perfect. So sometimes you might find, that there's an option that people want to just look at in the Hazop. So the way that I do that is make sure that we finish the scope of the Hazop. And then at the end of the Hazop, we get together again and we just re-examine that node, and I record it as a separate node, but using the proposed markup. And then I'll record that as another drawing in the pack to say that we've looked at this proposed markup and these are the risks associated with solving this problem in this way. Okay, so you can do it. However, what I would say is you need to do it in a really structured way. You need to be really open about it. And the drawings that you have, regardless of how wrong they are, those are the drawings that need to be Hazoped at that time. If you want to make an amendment, record that as a separate node so that it's very clear that it was recorded as an amendment. So I've got a question from Christopher. Thanks for your response before, but what you describe is not a digital twin environment. Okay, I'm referring to a complete 3D walkthrough replication of the asset with connectivity to all data information resulting down to the asset level. Environment could significantly reduce the time required to extract information to do the Hazop. Some Hazop data could be auto-populated. XBP engineer, yeah. So yeah, Chris, I have seen that facility available. I saw it advertised online once and then I couldn't find it again. So it'd be good to discuss that offline as well. But yes, I think that would be great a facility in the Hazop because it would allow you to answer a lot of the questions during the Hazop. However, I think you'd have to definitely have somebody who is competent in operating that environment, because if you're, I mean, I know even from a Hazop perspective, if you're using PHA Pro and the scribe in your Hazop hasn't used PHA Pro, that can throw your Hazop off. If you're now using another software and people are not familiar with using that, or you don't have someone competent to use that, that can definitely detract from the task at hand. So making sure that you have someone who's competent and who's specifically focused on that and using that to answer the questions, I think definitely could save some time. I've got another question from Mahmood. If you discover during the Hazop, SIF is not required, there's no hazardous consequence identified, what do you do to optimize maintenance cost? So during the Hazop, there is a good chance that you may identify that some of the safeguards are not required. However, I would exercise extreme caution. Have a look at the previous record to see why that safety instrument function was installed. Have you guys just completely missed it? You know, sometimes you might not realize one of the hazards, may not be thinking about it fully matured. So for example, we were Hazoping a system and we had a temperature alarm. And it seemed a really funny set point. It was set really rather low and the system downstream was rated to a much higher temperature. So at the time, we just couldn't figure out why, and it was a trip as well. So we had the alarm and then the trip, and we couldn't figure out why we had this high temperature alarm and trip with a high integrity. We couldn't figure it out. So we thought, okay, well, we'll raise a recommendation to review it because we can't see the reason. But actually, when we got several nodes down the way, we found out the reason for that alarm was linked to, was linked specifically to the lining in one of the tanks downstream. And if we had proposed to completely remove it, what we said was to review, but if we proposed to remove it, we would have been leaving that tank unprotected. So just really have a good think about it, have a review of the previous documents, try and talk to somebody who was in the previous workshop if you can. But if there really is no hazardous consequence identified associated with a SIF, you can propose to remove it. And I know that some designs have been overly zealous on allocating SIFs and also maybe haven't really documented things very well. So it's very difficult to identify whether the SIF is really required, or maybe it was put in for asset purposes, or maybe it was put in because that's just the thing that somebody had done before. So yes, challenge them if required. And yes, it will save you time on maintenance, but just be very careful and make sure that you understand what you're doing. So I've got another question from Amin. To what extent the facilitator can propose causes or consequences if the group is not active or experienced in this kind of study? And is there a Hazop database that can help the facilitator to find potential causes and consequences of certain common deviations? So, I mean, when you go through the guideword and the guideword and parameter, so for example, no flow, what I do generally is I just go through the entire PNID. Generally, I start with no flow because no flow has the most causes. For example, valve closed inadvertently, really, another valve closed, a lot of valves closing, maybe level transmitter not working, and then the valves not opening. So there's a lot of causes in no flow. And by doing that, so what I do generally is I go through the PNID and I just write down all the causes of no flow only. And that then when I get to the meeting, I say, okay, well, this is how we do it. We brainstorm the things. And when I go through, I say, okay, these are the ones I've identified. We walk through the PNID. It's a way of refreshing everybody on the PNID, walking through each valve that I've identified in the sequence. I say, is this credible that this valve might close? Now, it might be a fail open valve and it might normally be open, so maybe it's not credible. But we discuss each one of the valves. Say, is it credible? Have I missed any of the valves? And also typically I miss at least one valve so that I can test whether the team are actually paying attention to what I'm doing. So I miss a valve on purpose and I know which valve that is so that they can pick that up, and then that's a good way of getting them on board with this cause consequence. There's not really a database to help the facilitator find the potential causes and consequences because they depend on your drawing. But there is this document, which is the Hazard and Operability Study Application Guide. And it does have some standard some standard parameter and guide word requirements that you can use in your Hazop if you don't have a standard for yourself or for your facility. And then I've got this one by Tomas. What is your opinion about conducting risk assessment during the Hazop study for each scenario? Is it necessary, worth doing or not? I wonder because Hazop is rather a hazard identification tool, and IEC 61882, there is risk assessment described. So I'm not familiar with 61882. I'm familiar with 61508 and 61511. But the standards in general, they don't tell you how to do anything. They tell you what you need to achieve by doing what you do. So the ones that I'm familiar with, 61508 and 61511, they say you must manage the risk. In other words, you must know the consequences and the likelihood, and then assess the reliability of your safeguards. They don't say that you have to do that all in one workshop. Some workshop facilitators or some sites like to do the Hazop and LOPA together because the team is together. So they do the Hazop, and then when they identify a LOPA scenario, they just evaluate it straight away. And then other places like to complete the Hazop completely and then do the LOPA separately. I've seen that done much more commonly. I've mentioned before about doing your risk assessment, i.e. looking at your likelihood in the Hazop. My experience is that when you look at likelihood in the Hazop, it creates a lot of discussion, which is not actually helpful. It's much more helpful to spend time identifying the consequences associated with that cause and making sure you get those really nailed down, identifying which safeguards are already existing, and then evaluating offline. If you've identified a gap during the Hazop, evaluating offline what additional safeguards might be needed. If you try to do that in the workshop with the likelihood, I've seen a lot of people trying to make sure we don't get red, make sure that we only have a certain number of yellows, make sure everything is green. And it really detracts from the process of the Hazop if you're trying to do all of these different things at the same time. So I've got about 15 minutes left. So if you have any more questions, I've got one more from Tomas. How about consequence description in case that the initiating event occurs in the analyze node, but the consequences can be in another part of the installation? Do you identify only consequences in the analyze node? No, you need to consider consequences anywhere. So the cause is within the node, consequences are anywhere. And it can be a little bit tricky if you're Hazoping a big facility and you're starting at the first node. You might not actually understand fully the consequences in all the nodes. And so what you may do as a team, for example, if you're considering a high pressure separator as your first node, and you've got the wells coming in, and you say, okay, more flow of gas, right? So you could have more flow of gas, relief valve lifts, or your pressure control valve opens. It's fully sized. You assume that the flare, at that point, you may assume that the flare is sufficiently sized to take that load, right? But when you get to the flare, you might say, okay, well, these are the inputs that we had from the other nodes. For example, we could have 10 million scuffs, 5 million scuffs, whatever the numbers are. And then you say, okay, well, this is the design of our system, and these are the scenarios we identified in other nodes. Let's have a look at this system and see whether they can impact them, if they were to happen simultaneously, etc. So sometimes it can be a little bit tricky identifying the consequences everywhere, especially when you're just starting with the system. However, if you have an experienced facilitator, they can typically know the interrelationships between different systems based on their past experiences. So for example, if I'm doing a node on a separator and there's a high gas flow, I'm going to be asking questions about, is there potential for foaming? Because that could result in erosion on bends. Is there potential for high liquid level? Because the liquid carryover could cause liquid hammer in the flare. Is there a potential that we could liquid fill the flare system, which is something that happens surprisingly often. So these types of things I will start to ask during the session in that node, because I know that these things can happen downstream. I'm not saying they will happen in that system, but they can happen downstream, and I can start to ask those questions. But if you're starting new, if you have any query or you've made any assumptions, document them and then revisit them in the subsequent downstream nodes. So I've got a couple more questions. One is, if you assess the probability offline, what is the process to do that assessment? So if you're doing a LOPA or layer protection analysis, then it's you've got another workshop and you've got another team together. If you are just, so what generally I do, so for example, if you have everything above a severity 3 is going to go to layers of protection analysis, that's fine. So everything severity 3 and above goes to layer of protection analysis. I'm not going to worry about that for reassessment. And then severity 1 and 2 are something that we need to be assessing in this offline probability. What I would generally do is we'd have the facilitator and have 1 or 2 other team members, one normally being the HSC engineer or the process safety engineer, and then maybe the process engineer. And we'd just go through, sometimes just do it at the end of the day, is in that sort of mini team, and say, okay, well, this one, how likely is it? Has this happened at the facility, etc. So if it's a severity 1 and 2, what we're really trying to do is identify if this is something that's going to happen every single year, because that will be then a high likelihood low severity event, which is something we want to manage separately. So in general, what I do is if it's severity 3 or above, it depends on your risk matrix, how you structure it. But if that's going to LOPA, don't worry about it, and that will be done with a separate team. And then the ones which are lower severity will be done by a subset of the main team. If during that assessment you find you have a question, more than welcome to take that back to the team the next day or send the team an email or afterwards offline. I've got another question from Amin. Where do the future of Hazop, where do you see the future of Hazop? Is there more AI powered, or will we still see the conventional Hazop? So I think this is something that comes back to what Christopher was talking about. There are some tools for automation for Hazop. So what you do is you have to draw your PNIDs in a certain software, but you plug it in and it automatically identifies some of the things like block pump discharge resulting in high overpressure because there's no relief. It can maybe identify some HPLP interfaces which are not adequately protected. It can identify capacity issues associated with some valves with regards to draining of fluid from vessels, etc. So those things which can detract from the Hazop team's time, those things can be identified beforehand and fixed. However, those things should be identified now beforehand, and that's normally done in a PNID review before the Hazop, although sometimes time pressure means that's not done. And there are some companies which have checklists. And so I'm developing some of the checklists based on my experience, which you can apply to your drawing so that you can say, okay, well, I have a pump. It's a positive displacement pump. Let me ask these questions and I can quickly identify some things that will come up in the Hazop, and so that I don't have to have recommendations in the Hazop. I can fix that before I go into the Hazop, so saving you time. But I can definitely see that there is a potential that some of these AI systems can do some of that pre-screening for us, allowing us in the Hazop. I think definitely conventional Hazops will still remain, but allowing us in the Hazop to be thinking of those scenarios which cannot very easily be identified by computers. So I've got one here from Rajiv. What is the general standard for risk assessment and what is the criteria for a LARP? So that's a little bit outside of this forum. In the UK, we use some guidance from the HSE, and there's some guidance on a LARP there. What you really need to be doing with regards to setting your criteria for a LARP is your company needs to decide that, right? If you have only one petrol station and you have a scenario where the tanker, I don't know if you guys have seen the video where the tanker is filling the tanks underneath the petrol station, and for some reason the handbrake isn't working, and the truck starts to roll away, and then the petrol is spilling all over the forecourt, and there's a potential for a fire, and he needs to run after the truck. So okay, so if you have one petrol station and it fills those tanks, say once a week, so 52 times a year, you're going to be having a potential for that scenario. Considering that it may be human error, so 1 in 10 times he may make that error, you can start to see how likely that will be at your facility. Now, if you consider that maybe you have 100 petrol stations, you can then multiply that likelihood by 100, and you can see that actually the chance of your company having an incident like that is 100 times more likely than the chance of a company who only has one petrol station, just because of the number of facilities. And therefore, you may want to be a little bit more risk averse than the person who has only one facility. So it's really your company or your organization has to define your criteria for what risk tolerability you are going to manage and what you are willing to take. And then that is what you assess against, but not generally in the Hazop. Okay, I have another question. As a facilitator, do you push any idea when you feel something is wrong, or you ask many more questions to drive the team to understand the scenario more and or to come to the same direction that you feel is correct? So when you're facilitating a Hazop, your role is to get the team consensus. That may not be your understanding of the system. However, there are times when, as a facilitator, you understand something maybe that the team don't yet understand. So I've had a couple of scenarios when I've done this. One was when I facilitated a workshop. I wasn't told until 8 a.m. that I would be facilitating the workshop at 8:30 a.m. So I hadn't seen the drawings or anything. When I got to the session, I asked them just for a few minutes to have a look at the drawings before we started. And immediately I looked at the drawings, I identified what was a major design flaw in the system. right? Now, considering that everybody else in the room has been working on the system maybe months before me, I tried gently to raise the potential of this issue before we started, just to see if I could save time, but didn't appear to be a good awareness of this topic. So I just thought, okay, well, let's just follow the process through, and this will come up as a consequence in the Hazop. And it came up organically on its own, so the team identified it as a potential consequence. And then I put my 5 cents in to say, based on my experience, that the safeguards they had in place were insufficient for the severity of this consequence. And then we had the discussion then. So you just have to judge at the time. But if you identify something which has a hazard, it is your responsibility, whether you're the facilitator or a participant, to raise that in the meeting. As a team, you discuss it. And if the team do not agree that it is a potential hazardous consequence, unless you need to record the team consensus, right? When the facilitator writes the report, there is a further opportunity for the facilitator to then say, okay, well, we discussed as a team, this is what we agreed, it's recorded in the session. However, based on past experience, maybe referencing an incident which is available on the internet, you can say that this is a potential, and as a result, this is a chairman recommendation or facilitator recommendation post-workshop. So you can put that in to raise things which were not raised by the team or accepted by the team, if you feel strongly and you know that it is something that potentially can go wrong. What I would say is, it doesn't matter whether you're a facilitator or participant, don't keep quiet if you can see there's a potential something will go wrong, because the last thing you want to do is be quiet and then for that to be realized and for somebody to be injured. Much better to have the discussion with the team. If the team discarded, you document that you had the discussion, the team have discarded it, and then you can move on and feel assured that you've had the discussion, but don't keep quiet. And the last question here from Tamaz, and then I'll let you know what topic's coming next week. So do you allow on your Hazop studies some black boxes on PNIDs which are unknown part of the installation for all participants? Sometimes this happens, right? If you have a vendor package and your design is not sufficiently mature because you haven't identified your vendor, but you're Hazoping the rest of the system, yes, there will be a black box. What you have to assume is the worst case everywhere. So, for example, I had a black box recently, which was a vacuum package. So what it was doing was creating a vacuum on a column. Now, we didn't know anything about the vacuum package. We didn't know how it failed. We didn't know how frequently it failed. We didn't know if there was an open vent path when it failed. So what we did is we assumed the worst case, that if it failed, it would block the vent path for the column, and as a result, we could have an overpressure. And so each time we documented that. Obviously, we had a lot of things documented against that, but that means that that information can go forward to the vendor saying that, well, this is a really key risk associated with the process. Make sure that your safeguards for that are sufficiently designed. If you assume in the black box that everything is going to be okay, there's a good chance that you won't identify what really needs to be had attention paid to in that vendor package. And then the vendor can just give you a sort of a standard system, which maybe isn't really managing your risks on your facility well. Well, I just want to say thank you very much to everyone who's joined. Next week, really excited because we're going to be having David Hatch join us. And he's going to be discussing bow ties, how to not get yourself in a knot. So really looking forward to that session. He's really experienced on bow ties, and he has a lot of practical experience of how they're used. And he's also been posting a couple of posts this week on using the bow tie software with a layer of protection add-on, and how to do that. So maybe you guys can ask questions about that next week. So I hope that next week you guys can join us. I'm going to just put a short poll for feedback up so that we're always improving. there's no option for open feedback, but if you have any suggestions for future topics, just put them in the chat here, or you'll be redirected to another page when you end the session. Just put them in that there, so I can you know, let's line those up for future sessions. So Hazop was one of the things identified by one of the previous sessions. So I'm going to put the questions up now. If you guys just have an answer of those, let me know how the session went. Thanks very much, Amin and Christopher and Gustavo. If you need any more support on Hazop, you know where to find me on LinkedIn, or the redirect will send you to my webpage where you can find my email address if you need any. I'm going to end the video now. If you guys answer the poll, thank you so much, everyone, for attending and for the really good questions, really challenging questions on the session.